Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, I'm going to talk about gatekeeping. But I'm not going to talk about it in terms of what I usually talk about, which is in the past, but I'm going to talk about it in a future context. Because I've already dealt with the whole thing about the past, where you have these quote-unquote progressive, woke, SJW kinds of creators saying, you, the normal fan, me, the normal fan, used to gatekeep them from getting into this entertainment that we love. I think I've sufficiently dealt with that claim in my previous videos. No, today I'm going to talk about it in a future context. Because I've noticed over the last couple of months, a lot of people saying, look, we never did gatekeep our entertainment in the past, but perhaps we should have. Perhaps we should have kept these people out, because all they're doing right now is destroying our entertainment. And there's going to be nothing left of it soon. And within the last week, I ran across 4 videos in the channels that I watch talking about this exact thing. And I thought I should do a video about it, then I discounted that idea, until the same statement started showing up in the comments for my videos, saying, yeah, we need to start gatekeeping our entertainment and keep these quote-unquote progressive, these woke SJW people out of our entertainment. That's what we need to do. So I won't bury the lead. I'll tell you right up front, I don't think gatekeeping is the way to go. I don't think we should gatekeep our entertainment. Now, should we protect our entertainment? Yes, certainly, but gatekeeping is not the way to do it. Because, number one, I really don't think it's that effective. Number two, it plays right into the hands of these progressive people. And number three, it just isn't a severe enough way to deal with these people. And when I say that, some people might think, well, all you're doing is saying, yes, you want to gatekeep our entertainment, you just don't want to call it gatekeeping. Well, if you stick around and listen to my explanation, you'll see that where I want to go with this is that words have actual meanings, they have actual boundaries, and that's what we should follow. So yes, I think we should protect our entertainment, but gatekeeping is not the way to do it. Specifically, there are better ways. And it's not just, I don't want to call it that, it's we should do something completely different. It might have similar results, but we should do something different than gatekeeping. And again, the reason why we should do something different, which I'm going to explain, is because of those reasons that I just listed. Number one, it really isn't very effective. Just look at the fact that these quote-unquote progressive people, after they've taken over our entertainment, have been putting gatekeepers on our entertainment. How well has that worked for them? I really don't think it's worked that well. It started to work, but then they got a little pushback and things started to crumble. And we see it crumbling around them right now. And number two, it plays right into their hands in a number of ways. And the first part of that being that it plays into their hands because it reduces everything to the political, the social, and to power. It says the only way that you can protect a thing is through the political, is through the social. That's where your power comes from, and you need to exert that power over others in order to protect this thing. I don't think that's the case. I think you can protect something in a more natural way, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the other reason why I think it plays right into their hands is because you have people like Kelly Sue DeConnick, who writes comics, who writes a lot of influential comics. And I covered an interview with her that she did with a fairly large newspaper, I think it was the New York Times, where she talked about this exact thing. Well, first of all, this was in the middle of Trump's administration, so she talked about the fact that the reason why she got into writing to begin with was because she wanted to change the world. That is to say, she wanted to impose her political, progressive ideas upon people and have them think it's their own idea. But, she said, when Trump got into the White House, her reason for writing switched completely to providing a safe place, a bulwark, a stronghold for leftist leaders who were opposed to Trump so that when their time came again and they were in power, they could then go out and retake all of the territory that was lost. And quite specifically, I'm using militaristic terms because in part she uses them as well. But the whole fact of the matter is, again, you see, if you reduce it to the political, if you reduce it to power, all they're going to do is hide in their little nooks and crannies and make sure that the next time that they have an opportunity to destroy what we love, they're going to take it. Because again, the whole thing of what she was talking about was she was going to use her stories to create a safe house in the minds of the readers, or in other terms, to convince these readers that all these quote-unquote progressive ideas were actually true and they should be fighting for them as soon as they got that power back. And so, when the leaders did get that power back, then they would have a support base ready to go. That was her whole plan. That was what she declared was the reason why she was still creating stories. And so, if we start to gatekeep our entertainment, and we gain control over it once again, and the only way we have control over it is through gatekeeping, well, they're just going to bide their time until they can attack once again. And it's just going to flip back and forth, and it's just going to destroy things more and more. And the thing is that, again, I don't think gatekeeping is sufficient enough. Why? Because it's all based upon their mindset, all based upon the idea that you need to have a wall created by you, a political, social wall, and you need to have people and institutions that are keeping these gates, quote-unquote, safe for them and making sure that nobody they don't want in gets in. That is an inefficient way of doing things, but it's the only way they can do things because everything they believe is based upon the fact that everything is political, everything is based upon power. But for people like myself, there is a much stronger way to do things. And that stronger way to do things is to depend upon reality, is to depend upon the real, is to depend upon truth. What is the use of building a wall and putting people at every gate to make sure your enemies don't get in when you could just build the thing you want to build in the middle of a mountain range? If you have mountains on every side, if you have those natural defenses, it's going to be a far stronger defense than anything you could ever build, anything you could ever gatekeep. So I'm going to break off from that just for a moment to tell you why and how I started to think about these things and why you're looking at Walter Simonson Thor art in the background. Well, the thing was that I was working on my graphic novel, and I'm just polishing up the very last pages to give to the letterer because I wanted to give it a once-over once more just to make sure everything was correct. And there was one part where I thought something was missing. And I knew that thing that was missing was a sound effect. I had to put a sound effect in there, but I really couldn't figure out what it was. And so I did something completely useless. I went on the internet and looked at onomatopoeia, went through about a dozen pages of wasting my time looking for something which I should have known better just isn't there. And then I quit doing that and went to the master of storytelling, the master of sound effects in storytelling, certainly anyways, and that would be Walter Simonson. And so I pulled out of my collection his Thor run, which is his masterwork, and I started flipping through pages, and I knew after about 3 or 4 books exactly what I needed to do in order to make this sound effect, in order to make this scene work. And so later on in the day, after I had done that, I had a moment to myself, and I was sitting by my bookshelf, and I looked over, and something caught my eye. And what caught my eye was a work from Euclid called The Elements. And if you don't know what The Elements is, it's basically the fundamental book for Euclidean geometry. And I started to flip through that book, and I realized almost immediately why that book drew my eye. It was because the first time I was reading Walter Simonson and his great Thor run, I was taking a class in school of Euclidean geometry. Now, very briefly, I love Euclidean geometry, and if you've never encountered it, you might think it's just math. It's not math at all. I took an entire class on it, an entire year of Euclidean geometry, and we never once dealt with a number. We had an algebra class, we had a calculus class, and we had a Euclidean geometry class. Euclidean geometry is all about definitions, which lead into theorems and postulates. And so what you do is you basically memorize these basic definitions of what things are. And then you take those basic definitions and you combine them together to make more and more complex definitions of what is actually geometrically true. And then from that, well, at least in the class that I was in, what they did was they give you a problem. And this problem looks like a whole bunch of geometrical shapes thrown together in a connected way on a page. And each thing, each line, each angle, sometimes every shape is listed with a letter. And you have to prove that, let's say, this angle on this side of the page is equal to that angle way over on the other side of the page without using any numbers. You simply use the definitions and the theorems to go from one side to the other to connect them in the way through those definitions to prove that angle A is equal to angle Z. So the thing is, part of the reason why I love Euclidean geometry is because it introduced me to the core elements of logic. Because really what I think Aristotle was doing when he developed his system of logic is he took the elements of geometry and he simply used them to categorize words and phrases and sentences. And so the thing about Euclidean geometry and logic itself is that what each of them does is they take simple definitions of things we know to be true, and then it builds upon those simple definitions to more complex definitions and more complex descriptions of what we know is real. And this is an extremely powerful tool for anybody to get through life. But the point is, why I connected this to gatekeeping and thinking about gatekeeping is I was going through those fundamental definitions of Euclidean geometry. And as I said, those definitions are simple things. What is a point? What is a line? What is a straight line? Etc., etc. And I came to about the 13th definition, and it says, what is a boundary? And I'll read it for you now. A boundary is that which is the extremity of anything. And number 14 is a figure. A figure is that which is contained by any boundary or boundaries. And while I know those definitions and what they're talking about is referencing boundaries as they define it earlier on, I started to apply those simple definitions to what I was thinking about and gatekeeping. And that's when I realized that no, we don't need to gatekeep these things. We need to depend upon what is real. We need to depend upon the truth. We need to depend upon the natural, because that is what is going to defend what we actually hold dear, especially if what we hold dear is reality, is the truth, or at the very least is based upon those things. Because here's the fundamental truth that these quote-unquote progressive people don't accept. And the fundamental truth is that everything within this world has a boundary. Everything has a boundary. It has extremities, and when you go outside of those extremities, you're no longer within the boundary of that thing. And this is something they cannot abide. And the reason for this, I've discussed in the last couple of videos. The reason for this is because they simply want to be licentious. They simply want to indulge their vices. That is to say, they want to be vicious. And in order to do so, there can't be anything standing in the way of what they want to do. Anything at all. So if there's any boundary that comes up against what they want, they must either ignore it or destroy it. And again, this is their idea of liberty, that nothing can impose itself outside of them. Everything comes from the inside, and the only place that comes from is because they wish to indulge themselves in vice. That's it. So they had to twist the definition of what liberty actually is in order for it to be defined, at the very least in their minds, as no boundaries to anything if I don't say so. And of course, they don't say so if it gets in their way. And that's not the true definition of what liberty actually is. Liberty is the ability to follow what is right, what is true, what is good. Because of course, if you follow things that are not true, then you're actually making yourself a slave to error. There is no liberty in that. But here's the thing. If you wish to pursue this course of action, if you wish to protect what you love, not by gatekeeping, not by a gate and walls that's set up by political power, but by the natural fortifications, the mountain ranges of what is true and real, then you need to make some sacrifices. Because the thing is that I don't care if you're a progressive, a liberal, a conservative, we've all been brought up in these societies that we live in with the idea that liberty is doing whatever it is you want to do. The traditional definition of what liberty is, the ability to follow what is right and true and good, that has been under attack for centuries, and it was pretty much completely demolished in the 1960s. So much so that no one even considers that as the definition of liberty anymore. Almost everyone simply accepts as the common definition of liberty the ability to do whatever it is you want to do. And again, that leads to the mindset that there are no boundaries to anything. Because if there are boundaries to things outside of you, then you have to obey those boundaries if you accept that they actually exist. And that means it is going to infringe upon your ability to do whatever it is you want to do. But the natural defense that I'm talking about is simply to accept that everything in this world has boundaries, and that is to accept. And if you do that, you must discard the idea that liberty is doing whatever it is you want to do. Because again, when you accept those boundaries, you accept that there are boundaries to what you can do, what you should do, what you must do. And my example to that is I'm always talking about what the definition of a story is. The ancient definition, the definition that was used for the majority of Western civilization. And that definition is based upon some objective things. And so it's an objective definition of what a story actually is. Now, I had someone in my comments just this week actually baffled by the fact that I was saying, yes, there is such a thing as an objectively good story, and there is such a thing as an objectively bad story. They simply could not wrap their mind around that. But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is a definition for what a story actually is. If you go outside of that definition, it is no longer a story. And even if you are inside of that definition, there is such a thing as a good story and a bad story. And again, it depends upon the fundamental definitions of what actually is. And this is what I'm always talking about, whether I'm talking about Euclidean geometry, whether I'm talking about natural law, whether I'm talking about logic. Logic, I think, is the easiest one to actually go through. The basic way that you begin logic is you follow the steps from simple apprehension to judgment, which brings you into reason, which brings you into logic. Each of those steps need to be followed. And simple apprehension is simply defining what a thing is without making any judgments about it. That is to say, this thing is this definition. And when you define something like that, you are defining the boundaries and the extremities of what the thing actually is. And so, the fundamental point of that is you're accepting that these things in reality have boundaries. And not just have boundaries, but those boundaries are natural. There are many things in this world that exist objectively, and those boundaries would continue to be there, no matter whether all human beings cease to exist tomorrow. But those things which are dependent upon existing because human beings exist, the only reason they continue to exist and can exist without being destroyed is because, at their base, they themselves are dependent upon principles, higher principles, which are those fundamental things that would exist even if we didn't. And a good example of this was one of the videos I did a couple of weeks ago, where Richard over at Comics Matter was talking about Hawkeye and how he didn't think it really was woke, even though it had woke elements to it. And I really thought he was wrong on that. And it reminded me of those people who always argue that, well, if you're looking at comic books, there was always propaganda in comic books. Therefore, what's the problem of having propaganda in it now? Well, think about it for a second. I think about it, again, in geometrical or mathematical shapes. Think about stories themselves as a circle, and propaganda itself as a circle. They both exist in the same plane, and they both overlap in some degree. Not completely, just in some degree. Now, you can have stories then that are propaganda, and you can have propaganda that are stories, but that doesn't mean that every story is propaganda, and that doesn't mean that all propaganda is a story. They exist on the same plane because they're both a rhetorical argument. But just because some stories can be propaganda doesn't mean all stories are propaganda. But with these people who don't accept boundaries, they moved you and me and everyone else to the corner of the circle of stories where it overlapped with propaganda a long time ago. And then, slowly but subtly, they took us from stories into the circle of propaganda itself, where we no longer were within that circle of actual storytelling anymore. And they did that because they convinced everyone that those boundaries between those two things don't exist. But I'm sorry, there is a definition for what a story actually is. It is fixed. There is a definition for what propaganda actually is. It is fixed. Those two things do overlap, but they're not the same, and they have moved us into propaganda, from story into simply giving us the rhetorical argument of propaganda. That being a way to convince your audience of something in a way that gets around their rational mind. And one of the distinct differences between the two is that a story is under the category of art, and propaganda is under the category of politics. And again, here's the thing about art. Art is actually a virtue. I don't actually talk about it in those terms because it may be a little bit confusing. It's not an actual true virtue, because a true virtue is that which, when you follow it correctly, according to the definition of what it actually is, it will always lead you to the good. What art is, it's an intellectual virtue. That is to say, it has the earmarks of being a virtue, but when you follow it through, it can lead you to something good, but it can also lead you to something bad. It all depends on how you use it. And it gets a bit confusing because you can have an actual technically sound piece of art, which is very well put together, which will still lead you away from the truth. And that's the point where I think a lot of people, including Richard in his video about Hawkeye, actually went wrong. He's looking at this thing and saying, it's technically sound, therefore, is it leading us away from what actually is good? And I'm saying, yes, it is. It is leading you away from what is good. Just because it's technically sound doesn't mean it leads you to what is correct. And what is correct for a story is a representation of reality. And he talked about this in his video itself, saying, they had these scenes in Hawkeye where you knew it wasn't real. You looked at it, and if you ever lived in New York, you would say, that's just a progressive way of describing this thing. You would never get that in actual reality. So again, it was a bad story, even though it was a technically sound story. It was a bad story because it was leading you to believe, trying to get you to believe that things that are false are actually real. And again, you can see this if you accept the definitions of what a story is, if you can accept the definitions of what art is. Those old, tried and tested definitions for millennia, that a story is a representation of reality, that art exists because it must conform with reality. That is to say, you take something from your mind, an idea, and you bring it into external reality. And the only way you can actually bring it into external reality is if you follow those directions of what reality tells you you need to do in order to bring it into existence in the way that it's in your mind. That is how art actually works. But my whole point is centered around the idea of gatekeeping. We must abandon this idea of gatekeeping. Why? Because we must abandon the idea that our entertainment, our art, no matter what it is defined by the political, is defined by those who have power over it. It isn't. It has natural boundaries of its own. Those boundaries, sure, limit it to a very specific place and a very specific purpose, and sure, it limits you to what you can do with it. But that's just reality. And the thing is that if you actually wish to defend those things you love, that art that you love, then you must accept that it has boundaries. You must accept that it has definitions. What are those definitions? What are those boundaries? Well, as a conservative, I would say the best way to actually find that out for yourself is to go back to the point of the last known good. You could say to the last good save point. Go back to the last good save point, where these things actually worked, and look at the definition from there, and see if it's actually true. Determine that for yourself. Use reality to figure that out. Because what people are talking about in saying we need to have our own walls, we need to have our own gatekeepers, it's just setting up a mirror of what these progressive people actually have. It's the exact same thing that they have, just dependent upon different ideas. And it will crumble for us just as it is crumbling for them. Again, if we want to defend this thing, we need to be more severe than that. We need to go back to those high mountain walls that defend these things naturally. Because I'm sure there's more than one person out there who's listening to my voice, who keeps on thinking to themselves, I'm just getting sick and tired of this. Do I have to constantly defend this thing? Do I have to constantly put effort into defending what I love in order to make sure that I can still enjoy it? That's exhausting. I'm not going to do that anymore, so I'm just going to abandon it. My point is, no, you don't. All you're doing is playing according to their rules. All you're doing is saying that the only way I can keep this thing in a pristine way is to have power over it, is to have political, social power over it. You don't. All you gotta do is accept reality. All you gotta do is accept boundaries. All you gotta do is accept what is true and real. And those truths, those realities, will become the fortification of what you actually seek to defend. And since it does so according to the objective, it will do so without you having to be on guard every moment of every day. And so you don't need to exhaust yourself in order to defend this thing if you want to continue to enjoy it. You simply have to put it within its natural boundaries, where it actually belongs. And some people might not like that idea because it is much more extreme than actually gatekeeping. I will freely admit that. Because if we get people at large to go back to that way of thinking, and the only way we can do that really, I think, is by doing that within our own lives and showing it as an example of what works to others. But if we get the people around us to do that, we will go back to the point where you look at these people who don't accept boundaries, these people who keep going past the extremities of what a thing is. And when they try to define something outside of the natural definition of what a thing is, everyone will look at them and say, "You're either a loon or a liar. You're either crazy or you're trying to subvert what actually is." And that will indeed exclude, in a much deeper and harsher way, these people from getting their hands upon what they now control. Because they won't be given an inch. People will simply recognize them for what they are and what they're trying to do. They will say, "Look, in trying to go outside of the extremities of the definition of this thing, you're an extremist. That's what you are. And whether you're a loon or you're a liar, it all leads to the same point. All it leads to is destruction." So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.